So far what we've talked about are primarily animal cells and organelles that are common in both plant and animal cells. But plants have a few additional organelles that animal cells don't. The first one is the chloroplast. And the chloroplast has a double membrane, and it's this green organelle here. I always think it looks like it's got stacks of poker chips in it. Those are actually called thylakoids. This organelle contains the pigments that are able to capture sunlight energy and convert that into chemical energy. And so it's going to allow them to do the process we all know as photosynthesis. And this was a process where you build glucose from carbon dioxide and water as the building blocks, and the energy to do that comes from sunlight. I do want to point out that this plant cell also has mitochondria. Photosynthesis builds glucose, but it doesn't specifically provide us with a lot of ATP. So plants are going to use their mitochondria to make ATP, but the source of the glucose for the mitochondria is right next to it in the chloroplast. The central vacuole. Vacuoles, again, remember, are storage areas, and we find those in both plant and animal cells. But plants have a specific central vacuole that often takes up most of the volume of the cell. It's going to store water. Plants need a way to store lots of water, and also dissolve nutrients. It turns out that when this is full of water, it actually provides physical support for the cell. Plants don't have skeletons the way we do to provide structure. Part of having this central vacuole full of water is to provide support for the stem and the leaf so that it can stand up. Another piece of the support for the plant cell is cell walls. The cell wall is actually extracellular, so it's secreted by the cell, but it's outside the cell membrane. So here's the blue plasma membrane, and then the cell wall is directly outside of that. And it's made of cellulose, which is a complex carbohydrate. And remember, this is the complex carbohydrate that we are not able to digest. So it's this cell wall piece that's going to add fiber to our diets. This is also going to provide support and protection for plant cells. When we look at living organisms, there are single-celled organisms and multi-celled organisms. If you are single-celled, what that means is one cell can take care of all of life's functions, make energy, produce waste, reproduce. Everything happens in one cell. And I think at first we think single-celled organisms must be very simplistic, but in some ways it's even more amazing that a single cell can do all of these functions. So here's some little paramecium. This is a single-celled organism. It's covered in little hairs. It waves itself around, and here we have different organelles inside the cell. These guys are actually secondary consumers, so they're going to feed on other single-celled organisms in pond water. If you're multicellular, usually you have different cells that specialize for different life functions. And here's a picture of some of the different types of cells that we find in people. And you can see they all look very different. They all have the same basic components, the organelles that we've talked about. But here we have a nerve cell, muscle cell, bone cell, an egg and a sperm. All of these look very different based on their particular function. While all of these specialized cells have all of the typical eukaryotic organelles, you will find more of certain organelles in certain cells depending on their function. So consider a liver cell versus a muscle cell. Your liver is going to function to do a lot of detoxification. After you eat, your food is absorbed into the bloodstream, and that blood goes straight through the liver and toxins are taken away. So liver cells are going to need to have a lot of smooth ER to detoxify, and also lysosomes to break down different kinds of toxins. Muscle cells are going to need lots and lots of ATP, and so they're going to be packed full of mitochondria. Fat cell doesn't need a lot of mitochondria. It's mostly storage, and so that's going to have a lot of vacuoles in it. There's one particular kind of cell you may have heard about, and that's a stem cell. And this is a cell that can become any kind of specialized cell. If you think about the moment of conception, a sperm and egg come together and you form a new single cell. That's not yet a nerve cell or a bone cell or a muscle cell. Instead, that's what we call a stem cell. And that cell divides into 2 cells and then 4 cells and then 8 cells. And eventually, cells start to differentiate. And that means they start to become some different particular kind of cell. Later in the class, we'll talk more about biotechnology and some of the potential uses of stem cells. One of the interesting evolutionary questions is, how did the first organelles get inside eukaryotic cells? And the current explanation for that is the theory of endosymbiosis. And this is the idea that mitochondria and chloroplasts actually came from prokaryotic cells that got engulfed by a larger cell. We've got some Latin roots here. Endo means inside, sym together, bio life, and sys process. So this is the process of life coming inside to live together. Here's a simple picture to sort of illustrate this. Here we have a bigger cell, and then we have a smaller bacterial cell. And imagine this big cell is eating this little cell. But once this little cell was inside it, instead of digesting it right away, this cell actually started producing some energy. Maybe it had some pigments that allowed it to use sunlight energy. Maybe it was converting glucose into ATP. You can imagine at first this is your basic mutualistic relationship. This bacteria inside has a safe place to live, it's protected, and this larger cell is getting a free supply of glucose or ATP. Eventually, this mutualism became required. Neither cell could live without the other. That might sound a little bit far-fetched, but if you think about the evidence for this, there's a couple things. The first one is that both mitochondria and chloroplast have double membranes. And you can see if you have 2 single membrane organisms and one absorbs the other, you end up with something with a double membrane. The other thing that's probably more compelling in terms of evidence is that, remember, prokaryotic cells have circular DNA. And it turns out that if you go into your own cells and you go into your mitochondria have their own single loop of circular DNA. That is a throwback to the ancient bacterial ancestors of those mitochondria. Mitochondria and chloroplasts actually reproduce themselves and copy their own DNA. So circular DNA and the double membrane are the key pieces of evidence for the theory of endosymbiosis. If any of you are CSI fans, like to watch murder mysteries on TV, you'll hear people talk about mitochondrial DNA. Now, it turns out that you are 49.999% dad and 50.111% mom, because in the egg you actually got your first set of organelles from mom, including your mitochondria. And so your mitochondrial DNA is inherited from your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandmother. So my mitochondrial DNA is exactly identical to my brother's, and we got that from my mom, and she got it from her mom.